All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Marty Hurst. I'm the interim dean of the School of Information, and I want to thank you all for coming and attending today to the first annual Tech Policy Summit. I'd like to start by thanking the organizers of this event, most notably the Goldman School of Public Policy. I don't want to miss anyone. The Citrus Policy Lab, the Berkeley School of Information. We three are the co-hosts of this event, with additional co-sponsorship from the Berkeley Center for Law and Technology, the Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, and the UC Berkeley AI Policy Hub, as well as Berkeley Journalism. So I hope we have representatives from all of these groups here today. So policy and technology, the two together have not been it's been a topic of interest, but it's newly important today. And we really need different parts of campus coming together, as well as people from government, industry, and nonprofit organizations to tackle the new challenges in this space. I think of the word technology and policy. It's actually, technology policy is a noun-noun compound. So I have a computational linguistics background, so I think about it this way. And there's at least two different ways to parse that noun-noun compound. It's policy about technology, about how technology should work, but it can also mean technology to help with creating policy. I think it goes both ways, and that's why I'm really excited about the collaboration between the Goldman School and the School of Information, where we're actually doing joint hires in this space, where we want to bring together people that come at technology policy from both directions. No one individual can possibly have the expertise in the different combinations of these meanings. And so I hope that this summit, as well as other interactions that we have in the future, lay the path for finding the combinations, the varied combinations, to move policy forward and to move technology forward in a human-centered and society-centered way. With that, I want to introduce Brandy Nonecki, who is the organizer of this, the primary organizer, along with Jean Chen, of this wonderful event. Brandy wears many, many hats. She is known to many people around the world in the technology policy space. So let's give her a warm welcome.
Great, thank you so much. Well, it's really exciting to see all of you here today. Thank you for coming. And indeed, this was sort of a brainchild of me for a while now. But it could not be possible without the collaboration of all of our co-hosts and co-sponsors. So again, thank you so very much. I have a few announcements and some housekeeping. First, if you would like to access the agenda for today in the bios of all of our participants, you can go ahead and scan the QR code. That's going to take you to the Citrus Policy Lab website. We have a dedicated webpage just for today's event. So before we continue, I'd like to offer the following land acknowledgement on behalf of the hosts and sponsors of today's event. We recognize that UC Berkeley sits on the territory of the Huichin, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, the successors of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and other familial descendants of the Verona Band. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. Consistent with our values of community, inclusion, and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native people. As members of the Berkeley community, it is vitally important that we not only recognize the history of the land on which we stand, but also we recognize that the Muwekma Ohlone people are alive and flourishing members of the Berkeley and broader Bay Area community. So join me in thanking them for this land that we're having our event on today. Before I get into the housekeeping, there are a few things that I want to announce. You're welcome. We have Marty, our hosts, sponsors. It's me. First, in collaboration with the Goldman School of Public Policy, we have a show that is available via YouTube and podcast called Tech Hype, where we debunk misunderstandings around emerging technologies debate the real benefits and risks of the technology, and explore technical and policy solutions that will allow us to be able to harness emerging technology for good. So please check out our show at techhype.org. Now, I want to talk about another opportunity. I need to pull up my notes. So last year, I had the honor of working with Berkeley Law for their Berkeley Law AI Institute. We're organizing the next Berkeley Law AI Institute to be held in September of this year. The Berkeley Law AI Institute is the longest running program designed for legal, business, government, and nonprofit professionals supporting artificial intelligence initiatives, implementing AI in products and services, and showing that concern about technology's impact on individuals and society. Now in its 7th year, the AI Institute will take place September 25th through the 27th. I see you all marking your calendars right now. And it will be online and in person. You'll gain foundational understanding of AI and its near and long-term applications, become familiar with the complex global regulatory landscape defining the AI ecosystem, explore how AI technology intersects with law, ethics, and society, and improve your ability to advise clients or other entities within your organization to make informed business decisions and evaluate risks associated. If any of you are licensed attorneys, you can get the continuing legal education credit for the completion of this. And I want to point out that Jim Gilbert, who's the primary organizer of this, which you'll see in the back, if you have any questions about the summit, Jim is here to answer them. All right, now on to some housekeeping. Now, housekeeping for today, just letting you all know that the restrooms are down the hall. You'll see them there on your left. There's coffee. Please enjoy coffee. Lunch will be served, I believe, over in this space over here. And I also want to go just a quick run through the agenda. So first today, we're going to have a panel discussion talking about the EU AI Act. How many of you in this room know about the EU AI Act? Okay, good. We've got a bright group. So I expect a lot of questions during the Q&A portion, since you've all come with a lot of knowledge in this space. So we'll first do that panel discussion. Following that, we'll do a break. Then we will acknowledge and recognize the UC Berkeley Tech Policy Fellows in the inaugural cohort and launch the call for the 2024-2025 cohort. Following that, we will do round-robin discussions that are led by Tech Policy Fellows, faculty, and staff. And you'll see these numbers on the table. And we will explain what topics are associated with which number so that you can move yourself where you would like to be. Then we'll do lunch and do a round-robin report out, followed by a fireside chat where we're going to dig into some of the thorniest tech policy challenges. Following that, we will do another panel discussion about the tension between spurring innovation while simultaneously doing it in a responsible way. And after that, we will have a keynote from Mariacha Shaka on the power of technology versus the power of policy, followed by the giving of the inaugural UC Berkeley Tech Integrity Awards, which if you can see behind me, here are the awards. Aren't they beautiful? Ooh and ah at them for me, please. So we will have those and we'll give them to the recipients, and then we'll have final remarks from Dean Wilson from the Goldman School of Public Policy. Another bit of housekeeping. On your table, you will see some white cards and some little pencils. No, you're not playing mini golf today. You are going to use those to put your questions. So if you have any questions for any of the panelists or speakers, write them down on that card. We have individuals who will be coming around to grab those cards. And I think that's it. I think we're ready to start to move on to the first panel. So the panelists for the first one, if you could start to move yourselves up here to the front of the room, I will quickly announce the topic. So please, first panel, Yahweh is our moderator. Welcome. So I'll let you introduce yourself and everybody else.
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
Thank you, Brady.
My pleasure.
Testing. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this beautiful setting for today's summit. It's a real pleasure to be able to kick off the summit with this panel. And I thought it might be helpful for us to actually just start with some introductions. I think that you all have access to the full bios, but it might just be great for us to go down the panel and have everyone just introduce themselves. Folks on this panel are amazing experts within the realm of AI, and at the same time, they also wear many hats and have received quite a few accolades. So I'm pleased to start off. My name is Yao Ye. I am a lecturer here at Goldman School of Public Policy. I teach within the mid-career MPA program. I previously served as mayor of Palo Alto. My day job, though, is at Google, where I've led social impact across different verticals for the last 6 years. So happy to chime in when relevant, but also really excited more to hear the panel's perspectives today. So with that, let me pass it on.
Hi, I'm Deb Raji. I'm a current CS PhD student at UC Berkeley, and I'm also a senior trustworthy AI fellow at the Mozilla Foundation. And my research is mostly focused on AI and deployment, so sort of how do we evaluate and understand systems once they're released out in the world, and my policy engagement has been more on the sort of evaluation audit angle, and a lot of the policy proposals, including the EU AI Act, that take like a product liability perspective on the technology.
Hi, I'm Stuart Russell. I have been working here at Berkeley in artificial intelligence for a long time. Yeah, many hats, including being chair of computer science this semester. I think I was out of the room. Something happened, and there I am.
I was in awe of the awards, but I mean, this view is just unbelievable. And I'm in a football stadium, and so as a sports fan, this is the dream location. I'm Gerard de Graaf. I'm the head of the EU office in San Francisco. We have been here now for a year and a half. Before that, I'm also the senior envoy for digital to the United States. So I deal with AI, but also other issues. I mean, today is the day of entry into application of the Digital Markets Act. I should maybe note. And before that, I was in DG Connect, and DG Connect is the department in the Commission that produces a lot of the legislation that, I mean, particularly also the AI Act that we're going to talk about. And I really want to thank Brandy. Brandy is a star. Brandy is a great friend of Europe, and our cooperation with Berkeley is so excellent. And so maybe, I mean, you'll learn a little bit from me today, but we've learned so much from you over the year and a half that we're here. So tremendously grateful for all the support and all the expertise that you're sharing with us.
Hi, I'm Pam Samuelson. I teach at the Berkeley Law School. And in 1985, I wrote an article about allocating ownership rights in computer-generated works. So I've kind of been thinking about some of these issues for a long time, too. And more recently, I have been very active in commenting on the generative AI copyright cases that are pending in the US courts. And that has kept me very busy. But I'm also very interested to hear more from all of you about the AI Act, which as an American, I find really hard to kind of make my way through it. And I'm probably not alone in that, but hopefully some of the people on the panel here will be able to help decode it for you so that you can actually read it with a little bit more, shall I say, expertise.
Again, welcome to the panel. I know that this is going to be a really lively discussion. I know it was helpful to see the hands go up about who was aware of the EU AI Act already. And one thing that we thought would be helpful was to level set just around what the EU AI Act is. And so I wanted to turn to Gerard to be able to just share an overview, not to put you on the spot, but others on the panel, please do add in your perspectives too, just to help us understand a bit more about the EU AI Act and inform our discussion today.
I'm happy to do so. I will try to keep it simple, not to kind of kill this conference stone dead from the start. But before going into the EU AI Act, because otherwise, I might be sustaining this caricature that the European Union only cares about regulating technologies and not about technologies themselves. I mean, we are really excited about AI. We want to maximize the use and the benefits of AI in our societies. We also want to be a producer of AI. We don't just want to end up as a consumer of AI. So we're investing massively in AI. We're also facilitating access for startups and small companies to be able to kind of play an important role into this ecosystem. So that's like, just I needed to make that comment. But now the AI Act. But there's a political agreement that was reached after 36 hours of negotiations in December. It's the longest negotiation we've ever had on a legislative instrument. So I think it shows how seriously the European Union and the member states and the European Parliament have taken this instrument. It will be adopted sometime next month. We're waiting for the Parliament, European Parliament, to give its formal agreement to the final text. And then it will enter into force 20 days after publication in the official journal. And then we have a bit of a staggered implementation. But I think a couple of key points about the AI Act. I mean, one is we started, I mean, because often people say, oh, you don't really understand. That's what people say to me, oh, you don't understand, it's moving too quickly. I mean, and now you see it and then you in haste, you regulate. I mean, we've started looking at AI and policy and regulation 5 years ago. 2018, 2019, and actually bringing together a lot of experts from academia, from industry, etc., to try to come to grips with AI, because it's complicated. It's a technology that has many dimensions, and so we worked our way through it. So I think what I'm trying to say is that we have a little bit of understanding about how AI works and how you could regulate AI before we actually made a proposal for legislation, which we made in 2021 in the spring, so now 3 years ago. The approach that the European Union has taken is one of product safety. I mean, we are quite familiar in the European Union with the single market to regulate for product safety. And so what we do in the EU is to adopt directives, regulations that set out essential requirements so that consumers can trust that if they use an electronic device or a lawnmower or a hairdryer or washing machine, they're not going to be electrocuted, that it's safe and it's tested. And then there's standards that are being developed by standardization organizations, European standardization organizations, and then the companies or the distributors of these goods, these products, need to declare conformity with those standards. And by doing so, they are in compliance with the regulations. So that's the logic. So we focus on safe, secure, trustworthy AI. We set out some requirements that are necessary, and then these requirements will be translated into standards. And then when AI is put onto the market, then those who are developing it or deploying it need to demonstrate compliance with those standards or conformity with those standards. The approach is safety oriented, but very much also risk based. When people say, "Oh, to me, like, you're regulating AI," etc. Yeah, we do regulate AI, but we don't regulate all of AI. We regulate probably about 10% of AI, and that is not AI as a technology. It is AI when AI is used in particular situations where there could be a material risk to people that they might be disadvantaged if the AI that is being used is not trustworthy. And so just to give you some examples, and I think it's also quite important to make this distinction between the debate that we've been having in Europe and the debate that, particularly after ChatGPT was launched, you have witnessed here. I mean, we were focusing very much on the AI that's already in the market. And the discussion that you have here is very much about the very powerful generative AI and the frontier models and the risk that they may pose, and particularly kind of the models that are kind of coming to the market in the next couple of months or next couple of years. That is part of the AI Act, but a very large part of the AI Act is actually about situations where, like financial institutions, when you do a loan application, it's not a bank director that decides whether you qualify for the loan. It's an algorithm that decides that. If you apply for a job, in many cases, certainly for bigger organizations, it's an algorithm that does like the selection criterion and recommends like the appointment. If you go to a hospital for a medical diagnosis, I mean, in many cases, it's AI that's actually kind of analyzing like what disease you might have and recommending the most appropriate treatment for that disease. In law enforcement, you see increasingly use of AI, I mean, linked to facial recognition and kind of the image analysis, etc. So the AI is everywhere already in our societies. And in particular cases, and this is not made up, we have seen that AI in the European Union leads to unfair outcomes. Yeah, the country I know best, I'm from the Netherlands, the Dutch government almost fell because there was an AI used to decide the distribution of social benefits. And the AI kind of mistakenly, as appeared later, identified a large number of people, some 30,000 people, as fraudsters. That they were basically kind of collecting social benefits where they were not eligible for social benefits, and these people were prosecuted and all of these things. And it turned out that the AI that was being used by the government was biased, that the data it was using was not kind of accurate, and all say the kind of social, I mean, a lot of social harm was done as a result. And I think in a democratic society, I mean, people are entitled, we have our values. AI is not a neutral technology. I mean, we want AI in Europe to work for people. I mean, for our societies, to support our values and not undermine. And so to require that AI that is put onto the market in Europe is fair, is non-discriminatory, is transparent, explainable. So there's a recommendation or a decision coming out of AI, not a black box. Why did AI lead to that decision that you're not going to get that mortgage, so you're not being able to buy the house or to build the house that you want to buy? It's a very important decision in people's life. And there must be some explanation why that decision was taken, because the impacts of that decision were so significant. So that's what the AI Act focuses on. It's the use of AI in particular risk situations. We're not concerned about AI in use for like in GPS to get from point A to point B, or AI means my Spotify recommendations for music or spell check when I mean, that's not what we are concerned about. We are concerned about those situations where there could be negative material impacts on people. Much like with products, we don't want people to be harmed by the products they use. We don't want people to be harmed by the AI that's being used to take decisions about them. So that is in a nutshell. And then, I mean, we started with all of this, and it's interesting, in this country, there's not so much debate about like AI that's already in the market. And so maybe that's one kind of thing that deserves a little bit more debate. But of course, then ChatGPT came around and these models, and so you can imagine a little bit of shock during the negotiations, like, what is this? I mean, where that came out of little left field, as you know, that's baseball analogy, this is football, I know, but it is something that we had to come to grip with. And that's, for example, where we've worked a lot with experts here in Berkeley, like, and how would you regulate these very powerful models? And so there's a chapter now in the AI Act about these powerful models. We distinguish between really powerful models and then not so powerful models. And this is very much about issues like evaluations, I mean, to make sure that these models are safe as possible, also about transparency. So I'm sure we'll go into a little bit more than that, but I think from an EU AI Act perspective, it's important not just to focus on these powerful generative AI models, but to recognize that actually what the EU has been trying to do and is doing is to make sure that AI that's already in the market is fair and trustworthy. And if it's not, then it shouldn't be circulating on our market, or it should be removed from our market. And there's some prohibitions. There's like when you risk, there's actually a pyramid of risk. So there's like the very, very high risk where we say, no, that's not the AI we want in the European Union. Again, some of the examples of facial recognition, social credit scoring that you have, for example, in China. I mean, subliminal AI that works like with subliminal techniques and that tricks people into taking decisions that are manifestly not in their own interest. So those would be prohibited. Then you have high risk, so a number of situations lay down in the law where, I mean, say the safeguards are activated, and then you have limited or minimal risk where it's almost no responsibilities or transparency responsibilities, like to, for example, deep fake. I mean, to indicate that this is an image or this is a video that has been created with the help of AI. So that's in a nutshell, the AI Act. And of course, it's 150 pages or so. So there's a lot more than that, but this is the essence.
Thanks so much, Gerard. I did want to turn to the full panel and just recognize, our panel's focused on the EU AI Act. Gerard had mentioned, this is, of course, AI is cutting across jurisdictional boundaries, and there is a global context for us to contemplate. EU often is one of the first movers, but how do you all think through what the collaborative actions are, and if it's possible to harmonize a legislative or regulatory framework around AI?
I was going to say, yeah, I definitely agree that EU is the first mover. Like, we're still waiting for the US on certain things. I will say from my perspective, because I focus a lot on evaluation and auditing, a lot actually gets negotiated at that international level when it comes to, high-level directives in terms of standards and sort of articulating the expectations that we have for this technology. A lot of standards are set at that international level. ISO, IEEE are both international organizations, and they've been taking initiative in terms of some of these things. Following the EU AI Act, a lot of European standard-making bodies have begun very actively thinking about product safety standards, and that is something that will directly inform US product safety standards when it comes to that. And so from that perspective, like, there is a lot of very direct sort of harmonization, international harmonization questions when it comes to articulating what do we actually expect from this technology, what are our expectations around performance, validation, fairness. Some of these topics gets determined at that level. But like sort of you alluded to, enforcement is still pretty local in terms of market entry, right? So Gerard was sort of mentioning, one of the reasons why the EU AI Act is sort of orchestrated through this product safety lens is so that people can control what's currently on the market, what's currently affecting people today. And a lot of that enforcement, at least in the US, is still quite local. In some cases, when it comes to privacy and data protection, it's like at the state level or even municipal level, and when it comes to something like facial recognition. So I think enforcement is still very localized, but in terms of articulating standards and expectations for the technology, it's been cool to see the international efforts and the international coordination on that. And I think we would need more of that to sort of get to a very clear set of standards for the technology deployment.
So the US has a very different regulatory culture than the EU. And one of the things that's kind of admirable about the EU is that they think that they can basically sit down and talk for 5 years about stuff and then put together a big piece of legislation, and it's going to solve the problems for all time. That's actually, a regulatory culture that is admirable in its way, and the U.S. has just not got that kind of regulatory culture at all. And so there is a bit of a tussle between the U.S. and the EU about the AI Act. I think there are certainly aspects of the AI Act that that are resonating with policymakers in the U.S. Risk assessment is very much on everybody's mind. I think voluntary risk assessment is more the approach that is favored in the U.S. And I think the idea of paying attention to risk in different sectors is something that they have in common. But if you ask me, how quickly will the U.S. Congress adopt the AI Act? And the answer is never. Now, on one kind of theory, if all the companies have to comply with the AI Act, then the Brussels effect takes care of it, and Congress doesn't have to do anything. And I think that may be on the wish list of some people in Europe and the policy arena. I would not hold my breath on that one, but I think we'll see a little bit of back and forth. So collaboration, maybe on some issues, competition on others, and so we're still in very, very early stages. The AI Act hasn't even gotten adopted yet, and so we're going to kind of have the next 5 years of kind of like trying to figure out what this all means.
So I don't have too much to add, but I do want to mention China. And China's regulations were promulgated on I would say, large-scale AI systems were promulgated in April of last year. And contrary to many in the US who argue that the US shouldn't regulate AI because then that leaves the playing field to China, we call this the but China argument, which can be used to justify any amount of evil. Actually, China's regulations are much stricter even than the European Union. So, for example, they require large language models to output true and accurate information, which, as you know, is not possible for large language models. And so, in a sense, it's a de facto ban. In practice, it's a little weaker than that because what they really mean is towing the party line on any issue that's controversial, as they might put it. And so I do know of one company, one startup that has actually submitted their large language model to the regulators for approval. They haven't heard back yet about whether it's going to be approved, but it's a pretty brave step, I would say. But by and large, the tech companies in China have actually pulled back from public-facing models and are focusing more on B2B applications. So that's one point to make. The other point to make is that in regulation, there's a whole range of tools that regulators have, all the way from voluntary codes of conduct, which is currently where we are at in the US, pretty much for this technology, all the way to regulations that disallow products to even get on the market until they pass appropriate tests and evaluations, whatever those might be. So for example, you think about medicines, right? You cannot sell a medicine until it's been approved. And to get it approved, the government doesn't test medicines. They don't run a testing lab. They say, here is what we mean by proof of safety, and you have to submit to us, the regulator, that proof of safety. And it's clinical trials for medicines, for nuclear power. It's a massive mathematical proof of the mean time to failure of your system has to be at least 10 million years, right? And there's an agreed machine-readable format for that proof, and the regulator can check it and can push back against assumptions that you make and so on. And we're nowhere close to that in AI. There is not a single high-confidence statement that we can make about the present generation of AI systems. And I think, to me, that's problematic. And at the moment, the standard is, well, we red team it. We hire some smart people. We think our people are sufficiently smart, and they red team it for a while, and they find all kinds of problems. We don't fix them, and then we put it onto the market. So that's where we are at right now. But as Harad pointed out, the harms are real and large scale when you get these things wrong. And I think the AI Act is a step in the right direction, but it doesn't go far enough, in my view.
Great. It's really interesting to hear about some of the existing frameworks, as it relates to product safety. In a certain respect, it's acknowledging what's on the market already. So it's almost empirical versus predictive. And so how do you all think through, given how dynamic AI technology is, how either legislation or regulation or voluntary frameworks should evolve to be able to either keep up with the new data that regularly becomes available, or to even begin predicting where the technology might head. And that's to the full panel.
Okay, I'll take that one because people argue. I mean, you hear a lot of myths in this whole discussion. And people say these myths, and everyone else on panels nods wisely, and the people in the audience nod wisely, not realizing that they're assenting to something that's complete rubbish. So one of my favorites is, you can't regulate a general purpose technology. You can only regulate specific uses, right? And just look at electricity, right? We don't regulate electricity, but we do regulate electricity as a general purpose technology. We regulate the voltage, right? Because if we didn't, the utility could set fire to the entire Bay Area by sending in the wrong voltage, right? We regulate the plugs, we regulate the cables, right? We do tons of regulation at the general level for electricity because it's extremely dangerous. And we do that. So that's one myth. Another myth is you can't regulate a technology that doesn't exist yet, right? Again, this is, and everyone nods wisely, it's complete rubbish, right? We regulate drugs that don't exist yet by saying, whenever you invent this drug, you still got to show that it's safe and effective for the condition that it's targeted at. And that's it. So we don't regulate the technology in the sense of describing what the technology is or should be. We regulate it in the sense of describing its effect, right? And basically we want it to be beneficial and not harmful. And we can say that for AI, no matter how capable it becomes.
Can I add a third? I mean, as we are now myth busting, I mean, maybe there's a few more myths that could be busted. And a myth also I am often exposed to is say, like, if you regulate, you stifle innovation. And that, as if it is some kind of a trade-off. You have a little bit more safety and you have a little bit of innovation. Well, there are actually kind of examples like where we may, like in nuclear weapons, etc. I'm not sure we're looking for more innovation in that area. So there and the prohibited uses of AI, that's definitely not what we want to see. So definitely there is a little bit of like not that innovation, please. But I mean, if you provide predictability in the market, I mean, you make clear what the rules are. Everybody can compete on the basis of a level playing field. I mean, and look at, I mean, survey after survey after survey, wherever you kind of interview people, there is a considerable distrust of AI. And it's about 50%. You look at the EU, you look at the US, you look at other countries, I mean, 50% say, not sure AI, I don't really trust it. A market is not going to be very innovative and very dynamic if like half of the people you want to sell your product to say, well, I'm really not interested in this market. So and we in the European Union, and you can give other examples, you give the example of electricity, and we have regulated in the European Union. I mean, I complain all the time about PG&E. And in the European Union, I can change energy provider every day of the week. If I'm unhappy with my energy provider, I can immediately go to another energy provider because I've got choice. Well, why is that? Because we regulated. We opened up that market, and here not. And there's many of these examples that you can give where regulation is actually stimulating innovation. Do you think that the car industry would have improved fuel efficiency or limited emissions on its own bat, No, surely not, because they were forced to do so, including in this state. So that's another myth that kind of there is. Yeah, of course, if you regulate in a bad way, yeah, you can stifle innovation. Absolutely, there's no question about it. But if good regulation, that is like opening up, is not heavy-handed regulation, I think is definitely pro or can be pro innovation. And I take a little bit of, disagree a little bit about, I think at the moment, there is a different tradition in terms of policy making. And we are more this kind of, call it comprehensive. And we cover the whole waterfront. We do very conceptual, and then we come out with something holistic. And that's probably not many in the world that have that type of regulatory approach. But I think at the moment in the US, it's very difficult to pass any piece of legislation in Washington, D.C., and I'm not saying anything that's like, like out of my brief as a foreign diplomat in this country. I'm just observing what's happening in this country. But if you look at the state level, I was last week together with Brandy, we testified before the California legislature. There are 40 bills in California on AI, and definitely a few of them will pass. And there's a lot of activity in other states. So there is legislation happening, not in Washington, D.C., but in a lot of the states. And we have a little bit of experience in the European Union with fragmentation, where we have 27 member states, and they're not going to wait until Brussels gets its act together. They will legislate, and they will do so in different ways. And when people say, well, why don't you have more big companies in digital, and why don't you have a Google in the European Union? Is because our market has been tremendously fragmented. If you want to grow in the European Union, it is very hard because the rules are different. So you are successful in one market, you want to go to another market, you have to adjust your business model. Well, in an internet, it's all about scale and speed. In the Olympics, if you are second or third, you still get a medal, but not in the internet. If you're second or third, you're like the first loser. And so what I see as a risk to the US is that, yes, there is no action, and I'm not sure it's actually kind of deliberate, like, well, let's not do it. I think it's simply, the US government almost, or the Congress almost not, kind of can't keep the government running. So I don't think there's like a real theory here that no regulation is the best way forward for the US, but that's my personal opinion. But you're going to a situation with huge fragmentation in the United States if you're not careful. And this is like, it's interesting. We come from a situation of huge fragmentation. We have the EU AI Act, one set of rules for the whole European market, 450 million users, one set of rules. You might like them or not like them, but there's no other rules that you have to comply with. And here in this country, if you're not careful, you go exactly the opposite direction. We'll meet somewhere in the middle, and then we go to the single market, and the US will go to the single market that we didn't have for many years in the European Union.
Just to add very briefly, just to push back on a couple points, though. So I first got involved in AI policy in 2019 with the Digital Services Act. Like I mentioned, a lot of my research is on evaluation auditing. There was sort of Article 31 and 29 at the time. I'm sure the numbers have shifted. We're very oriented around independent audits and data access, and this was very much in the wheelhouse of my research, and that's sort of my first entry into the policy engagement in the space, and especially interacting with sort of the EU policy tradition around these things. The Digital Services Act is now in effect. It's been in effect, since late last year, and we've seen a change in terms of corporate behavior. Now we have transparency reports, and from a auditor evaluator side of perspective of things, it's much easier to request for access. It's much easier to sort of request for sort of legal protection and safe harbor. Even though, as a U.S. researcher on online platforms and evaluating these online platforms, and we have way more visibility into what these systems are actually doing because of the required transparency reports and compliance to that act. So I do think there is kind of the side effect of EU policy that has been great because, to the point raised earlier, DC is incredible, but incredibly polarized as well. And even though there's been efforts by, Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has put together these AI insight forums, there's been some activity. There's now this AI advisory committee in the House. And so there's been efforts, bipartisan efforts, to try to rally together bipartisan interest in AI policy to get to some legislation at that federal level. But we haven't really seen it yet. And in the meantime, I think the EU has been taking the lead in terms of, definitely from the transparency perspective, getting us the information that we need in order to start thinking about those assessments and start thinking about those standards that Stuart was mentioning that will sort of be required for that next generation set of systems and even the current set of systems. So I wanted to start with pointing that out. I think a second point I wanted to make was your initial question was sort of the evolution of this term artificial intelligence and how it's evolved. I think something that's interesting to me about the EU AI Act, at least from my first interaction with it to where it is today, is just how much that term artificial intelligence evolved and that definition evolved even within the act itself. So the initial drafts were, again, coming off of the DSA and other sort of efforts happening in the EU at the time, very focused on recommendation systems and sort of algorithms in that context, very focused on risk assessments. And then, with ChatGPT, suddenly there was this interest and discussion of like general purpose AI systems, and that drastically shifted. And a lot of what made that negotiation, that 48-hour negotiation that Gerard was mentioning, so long was because people were debating the inclusion of this new set of technologies or this new definition of AI. And I actually remember, Stuart, I don't know if you remember this, but like in 2020 or something, we organized some workshop on research ethics at a conference, and I was asking you sort of like, what's your definition of AGI? And this is pre-ChatGPT, and you were like, self-driving cars. If we solve self-driving cars, we sort of solved AGI. And of course now your response might be different. And so I do think the technology and what gets put into that bucket of AI shifts a lot over time, and is something that needs to be tracked a little bit more carefully. Like, facial recognition used to be, I sort of also got involved on the US policy side through facial recognition and evaluating facial recognition systems. And that was really the definition of AI at the sort of federal level in like the summer of 2019. But if you go and you talk to anyone in Congress today, they're very focused on chatbots and ChatGPT. And so for me, I feel like AI is this sort of very nebulous, almost marketing term, where people sort of shift that label to whatever type of underlying technology they choose to focus on at any given time. And I think as policymakers, being much more specific about the scope of your regulation is incredibly important, because I do notice sometimes how companies will decide to shift that label in order to escape certain responsibilities or shift the scope of what they are held accountable for. I think one of the big critiques of the EU AI Act is the risk-based tiering of these technologies. I think the rationale behind it makes a lot of sense, but it also puts companies in a position to do a bit of regulatory arbitrage to say that their technology might not fall into this bucket versus that bucket. In the healthcare space with the FDA, they're now struggling with people saying that their particular machine learning model is maybe not used in a particular way, and so it doesn't fall under AI, ML as a medical device. Like, there's a lot of regulatory arbitrage happening in very specific sectors like healthcare right now, because people just want to escape that label or put themselves in that label when it's convenient. And I think that that's something that, as policymakers especially, there should be a lot of attention to. There's a cluster of technologies that are put under this label of AI. And what does that term actually mean in a particular piece of legislation is going to be incredibly important to getting to actual accountability.
So can I chime in?
Yeah. Pamela, I was just about to bring you into the conversation from a legal perspective.
So I think that one theory about states taking the lead in the U.S. Is that there's a kind of bubbling up sometimes, and maybe some states actually come up with a good idea. And one of those ideas might actually then be a model for an eventual federal law. And there are examples of that kind of thing happening, not in this particular space right now. But I think part of what's going on in the state in terms of activities is that AI is like a buzzword now. And there's a lot of performativeness happening. In terms of like, oh, I'm going to regulate AI because AI is the thing. And so I wouldn't get too excited about that. I think that at least in California, there's a lot of thought going into what are possible ways to do some regulation that do kind of foster the safety that we would like to see and trust that we'd like to see, while at the same time not stifling innovation. California in particular would like to have a lot of companies based here, and they are now. So there's a desire not to regulate in a way that would send people off. But I also think that for most American companies, the president's executive order and the way that the trying to sort of essentially marshal some of the activities of different agencies and to sort of alert them to the kinds of things that they might want to or they should pay attention to as AI systems are deployed. I think that's actually a healthy thing, because it means that it's not like the top is speaking and everybody has to comply. It is kind of like the top basically saying, hey, this agency should pay attention to this agency should pay attention to that, and there's, I think, much more kind of back and forth between the companies and the lead companies and policymakers here, and I think what is a constructive way. So, on the question of whether or not the AI Act is going to spur lots of innovation and lots of AI growth in Europe, we will wait to see that. I know that you want to say, oh, ours is basically going to foster all this great innovation. And I hope that's true, but I actually doubt it. If I had to give advice to American companies about what to do, I'd basically say, start here, grow here, and when you get big enough, maybe you want to enter the EU, because the cost of compliance, all the paperwork you have to do, all the compliance things that you have to do, imposes a lot of costs, and those costs are maybe ones you're willing to bear. But one of the things that we kind of are concerned with, I think, here in the U.S. is with startups, and there's a lot of startups happening, and a lot of nonprofit activity also in AI, and some of those nonprofits in particular just can't afford the kind of compliance that the EU wants to impose.
Can I? I mean, panels are always very interesting when people disagree on panels. So now this, no. So, I mean, I think first of all on the issue of, I mean, well, maybe on the compliance side of things. Obviously, there are kind of compliance implications, but I mean, we are talking about a technology here that is so fundamentally disruptive to our societies, to our economies, where the risks that we are talking about aren't risks that are in the future. They're risks that are already now. And so to have this kind of approach, I mean, I recognize the approach because we had the same approach to social media. The internet somehow was different, couldn't be regulated, was too complicated, and let's just agree what kind of mess we came into, and now we're kind of going back, and the DSA and the DMA, it's all like recouping, coming back in as governments and say, well, this is not the kind of role, we don't want these negative externalities of these platforms. So this kind of starting position that because it's AI, governments, your primary kind of contribution is to stay as far as possible away from it, is again a myth that we would not accept in the European Union. I mean, if you would say the same thing for pharma, for medication, or airplanes, okay, no, there's no need to check the safety of an airplane. Just try it out. Okay, one or two might crash, but that's then all in the game. Or some people might get sick or die from medication that hasn't been, I mean, nobody would accept that. And so why would we put that standard at a very low level for AI, where we put it generally at a very high level for everything else? That kind of, just as a European, just kind of is beyond me. And I think for most Europeans. So we make no apology in the European Union for regulating AI. No apology. We're actually telling people like, okay, well, why are you not regulating? The onus is on the ones that are not regulating. I mean, it's interesting to hear Stuart say the AI Act doesn't go far enough. You need more than you need like another act on top of the AI Act. So that I find that a strange kind of way of presenting things, because, and I think it's also not in the interest of the industry. And actually, interestingly, the industry is asking for, well, I think the word regulation in this country is so taboo. So you have invented a new word, and it's called guardrails, which, I mean, in the European Union, we have it alongside motorways, etc., guardrails, so that you just kind of, okay, well, let's use the word guardrails, why not? But effectively, you're talking about regulation here. And so, I mean, even the industry says, give us some kind of framework within which we can operate. Because also we ourselves are a little bit concerned about the risk of particularly the models that we are now putting into the market. So we want to have some kind of safety around all of this. So let's have an objective discussion, and then the US will come out. I mean, you mentioned about harmonization of regulation. I think that's not on the cards because we're different. We have different traditions, but at least have like a a kind of a shared analysis about this, and then just every kind of jurisdiction will do what it considers to be the best thing to do. And so I think, and then back to the trust, because what will happen in this country is, I mean, because there'll be liability questions. And they go to the court, and people will get harmed and say, look, and this is caused by the AI, and so it's going to be, again, it's going to be a mess. If you don't put a frame, we don't, I mean, we're not so litigious in the European Union as people are here in the US, but we put the emphasis on kind of making sure that you meet the product safety standards, because then we have less problems that kind of might end up in the court where people are going to get into class action and all kind of litigation. And if there are cases that go to that type of like liability, if a company says, but I have complied with the EU AI Act, and the burden of proof is on, say, the other party to say, but nevertheless, you should carry a degree of liability. So, I mean, it's interesting from a law professor to argue against, say, the legal certainty that law provides. But we think that legal certainty, with the kind of 50% of people say, I don't really trust it. We also don't want, I mean, we want our values to be maintained and secured. We have learned our lessons with social media. We don't apologize for the UAI Act, and we think it's proportionate because it's risk-based, and if there's no risk, there's not much paperwork to fill in. But if you're doing, like, if you, also again in medication, yeah, it costs a lot of money to get your medication kind of agreed and approved before you can put it onto the European market. And why should that be different for AI if it creates risk into the market? And the EU is a big market. It's a big market. Companies from the US cannot just ignore the size of the EU market.
Sorry, can I respond?
Yeah. Let me do a quick. Let me just more for panel timing. After this question, we just want to invite the audience also. The value of disagreement is that it really can seed a lot of good questions from the audience. So hope you have questions, and you can submit them on the card, and then just raise it so we can come and get it from you. But Deb.
Yeah, I just wanted to give a different type of rebuttal to Pam's comment, because I do feel like that conversation around regulation and innovation does come up quite a bit. And I hear Gerard's point around trust, like people don't trust these systems if they're not adequately regulated. I think there's also been sort of an increasing awareness, at least from those that are operating from the evaluation perspective, that some of the claims around the effectiveness of this technology is also quite overblown. So, people have been writing about AI snake oil and sort of the reality of the fact that we don't actually have assurances around the effectiveness of these technologies. Stuart kind of mentioned this example of the drug regulation industry. If you read the history of how the FDA even came to be, it was literally because people were peddling literal snake oil as like medical remedies, and it was a completely unregulated market. And it wasn't just about safety. It was safety on one hand, but it was also about guarantees around the effectiveness and the legitimacy of some of these things. False advertising, some of that dimension of the problem, I think gets lost in the conversation. And I wanted to also flag, like, the AI Now Institute sort of wrote a report recently looking at the history of the FDA and how a similar sort of agency on the AI front could be emulated after sort of that history of the FDA. And they were kind of commenting on balancing this sort of cost-benefit analysis of, do we actually have guarantees of the benefits that AI is meant to provide in terms of the workflows of, everyday white-collar workers, in terms of, education or healthcare? Like, when we introduce these technologies, do we actually have assurances about how effective and how much benefit it's going to provide in addition to the costs or those risks or those harms? And I think the lack of clarity around that calculation in the AI space is also a point of tension, and the sort of proliferation of fake AI companies or AI snake oil is another point where if we regulate this space, we'll actually have sort of the legitimate sort of applications or the legitimate products sort of more prevalent or more visible in the market, and sort of squash this upcoming industry of fake AI products or inadequately evaluated and tested, vetted AI products.
So I gotta get another word in here.
Pam, let me turn to you for the last word on this question.
I think it's a mistake to think that I'm against regulation. I'm a law professor, and regulation is what I do. But I think important to sort of understand when it comes to something like product safety, there are already lots of laws on the books, okay? So the idea that there's no remedy at all if lots of injury happens is baloney. There are plenty of laws on the books. And before I sat down and tried to write an AI Act for the US, I'd want to say, here's the landscape where the existing legal infrastructure is going to handle this problem, and this problem. And one of the things that at least the Federal Trade Commission has been for a long time is a tracker of developing new technologies and convening groups of people who are involved in the technology development, who are concerned about technology development, and they take action. If you promulgate a privacy policy and then you don't follow it, even though there's not a national privacy law the way that there is in the EU, the FTC will come after you, and they will basically not only tell you you can't use that data anymore, but algorithms that you might have trained on it basically can be ordered to be destroyed. So I think that before I do some regulatory, yes, let's do that, I'd like to have a little bit more clarity about where is the part that isn't already in the existing infrastructure.
Just one more remark. I mean, so
I've lost control.
So a remark in two parts, right? So one part is, my friend Emily runs the Food Standards Agency in the UK, and she assures me that the requirements to open a restaurant and sell food to people are considerably more rigorous than those to create an AI company and put software in the market. And yet, we open more than 1 million independent startup restaurants in the world every year, right? So it's not a serious barrier that some tech people believe. I just think tech people have got used to having no regulation whatsoever. Absolutely. Because their lobbyists have been so successful in whispering regulation stifles innovation into the ears of legislators for decades and decades. But also, I think the European AI Act actually acknowledges that many of the applications, for example, giving financial advice, right, that's already regulated in the EU, and it says basically the rules that you apply to AI systems that do that will basically piggyback on whatever is already operating in that sector. And the same would be true in the US. And the FDA already has its checklist for AI in medicine. If you're diagnosing diseases, you've got to comply with all kinds of standards that already exist. So I think it's not the EUA Act is not trying to write law for every single sector. It's basically building on that law. But I think this notion of remedy is important, and I think the US has a pretty robust after-the-fact tort system. But coming back to the FDA, so one of the precursor event of the FDA was the Jake leg episode. And the Jake leg is a name for a particular kind of paralysis from the waist down that afflicted 400,000 people who took a patent medicine that was not regulated. And if you just think about, if that happened now, what would you get in a court case for a lifetime of being paralyzed and in a wheelchair? Maybe at least 25 million. You multiply that by 400,000 people, that's $10 trillion. Okay, so that's just one example of what happens when you have unregulated products distributed at scale. And a post hoc remedy obviously wouldn't be the right answer in that type of situation. So we have to think about some regulations that are going to require evidence of safety before things are placed into the market.
Thank you to the panel. We've got questions. Let me turn first actually to Brandy, the kickoff question.
Actually, the point I was going to make was just made. It was ex ante versus ex post. Do you regulate before, or do you remedy for harms that are caused after? So, thank you.
Great. I wanted to pull up one question from the audience. How do we regulate open source models?
So this is a great question, and it came up right at the end with the AI Act, where France and Germany tried to rip out the section of the AI Act relating to foundation models, basically large language models, in order to defend their national champions, Mistral, Lighton in France, and Aleph Alpha in Germany. And it was a knockdown, drag-out, midnight fight between the authors of the act and the European Parliament, who really wanted to keep that, and France and Germany, who wanted to rip it out. And we ended up with a compromise where open source AI systems are excluded from a lot of the regulations applicable to foundation models unless they are so large, on the scale that's about 10 times bigger than where we are now with GPT-4 and Gemini. And often open source is just presented almost as a religious principle, that open source is just necessarily an unalloyed good. But of course, if you think about open source medicines, right? As long as you're giving it away for free, it doesn't have to be safe, right? Open source nuclear fuel enrichment, right? As long as you're giving away the technology to everybody to enrich nuclear fuel, then it doesn't have to be regulated, right? It makes no sense whatsoever. And in fact, if you think about it, whatever risks there are from closed source systems are probably bigger from open source systems, because at least with the closed source systems, the regulator knows where they are, right? And knows that typically the operator is going to be registered, licensed, will have appropriate insurance and compliance departments and whatever. The open source case, none of that applies. So even just knowing what exists seems to require that open source systems contain non-removable self-registering code, so that when you give out tens of thousands of copies, when those copies run, they register themselves, and then also non-removable off switch. So if they exhibit unacceptable behaviors, the regulator can turn them off.
So I'm a trustworthy AI fellow at Mozilla Foundation. So, if you want to meet open source, religiously committed open source folks, I highly recommended visiting Mozilla, where, for context for those in the room, like Mozilla is sort of an organization that was built around Firefox, which is like the open source browser in the browser wars, the internet browser wars. And so they have a history of commitment to open source and open source communities, and now they're very much involved. I would say Mozilla Foundation, Linux Foundation have really taken a strong position on open source. And I think personally, my position has been informed by that. So yeah, definitely take what I say with a grain of salt. But I think it's from my perspective as someone that's thinking about the evaluation aspect of things, I have no guarantees of what's happening with a closed source model, and all the information, a lot of the information we have about how these systems work, that inform how we develop standards for these systems, how we develop evaluations for these systems, are based off of open source systems. So a lot of the data audits that are now informing, like the New York Times lawsuit against OpenAI, in that lawsuit, they cite research that is based off of open source data sets. And that's the only way that they were able to get a hint to the fact that perhaps their content was part of the training set of OpenAI's closed source models. So open source data sets, open source models have been a critical aspect of just even comprehending or beginning to understand what these models are doing, the kind of data that they're trained on. I'm not sure if a lot of folks saw, but there was also a recent study from Stanford looking into, again, open source data sets that are available or that are training open source models that give us a hint as to what might be used for closed source models. And they were able to find, that there was sort of child abuse, sexual material in there. And that again spurred a conversation about how much we can scrutinize these closed source models and what guarantees we have of anything in terms of the closed source models versus the open source case. In this situation, we could take action. We could remove the open source data set. We can remove the open source repo for the models that are trained on this data set. Hugging Face and other sort of model distribution platforms like GitHub and Hugging Face have actually been working with Mozilla and the Linux Foundation. They've played a very critical role in sort of playing this sort of platform regulator role within the open source community. And so there are mechanisms of quote unquote controlling open source models and their distribution that have developed over the years. But I think the interesting thing is that as this evolves in the open source space, in the closed source space, we know less than, I don't have any idea of what, Claude 3 was, that's Anthropic's model, was trained on, or what OpenAI was trained on. OpenAI's sort of ChatGPT was trained on. I actually had an interesting experience recently where I was interacting with folks from these companies and asking them just for more information about their systems and how it worked. And we came to recognize that even some of the assumptions that people have around how well monitored, so I think one of the common arguments for closed source is that, in a closed source setting, you can monitor the queries. So you can monitor what people are sending to the model. You can monitor their responses. You can maybe, because there's a terms of service and not just an open source use license, you can go after, malicious users in a different way in the closed source setting than in the open source setting. That's a very common argument. But interacting with some of these companies, we realized there's actually not a very robust internal infrastructure available yet to monitor over 100 million monthly users of ChatGPT. And they're still really thinking about how to enforce their terms of service in a way that is effective at clamping down on some of these malicious users. I think a recent case of this is the case of, I'm not sure if people were aware, but there was this case of non-consensual intimate imagery of Taylor Swift that had sort of made its way through some of these image generation models. And that model was actually Azure. It was a Microsoft closed model that they were able to sort of jailbreak to be able to generate these images and distribute on various online platforms. And so that was a closed model that generated that. And again, Microsoft was able to take action. A lot of the platforms, Twitter, Facebook, clamped down on search results for Taylor Swift during that period where it was proliferating. There was a lot of different actors that took action to address the situation, but the key sort of factor in whether it happened or not was not that the model was open source. In this case, it was a closed source model. And so I'm beginning to question that paradigm of, is open source really less safe than closed source? Because at least we have visibility into open source models in a way that we don't for closed source models. And it's very clear that a lot of harm can still be perpetuated with closed source models.
So I just want to make a couple of points. So I'm not opposed to open data, right? And that's two different things, right? The issue is, do you give away the model that you train or not, right? And then the second point is, we're not talking about, so open and closed are to do with, are you giving away the model that you've trained or not? It's nothing to do with, are you preventing regulators from having access to test the model or to examine the data sets on which it was trained. So I completely agree with you. We need regulatory auditing access to the closed source models. Okay, I'll leave it there because we actually want to get to more questions, I think.
Yeah, I just to the point around the open data, sorry. I think there's a gradient of openness in this space, right? So free software is a term that was used in sort of the historical open source days, and that would be the equivalent of sort of releasing model weights, or open weights as like, some of the folks at HAI have been calling it, versus, releasing training code and data and having sort of like an actual open source model. I think even under those circumstances, sort of like if you think of the Llama models that are released by Meta, that were open sourced by Meta, sort of in the free software sense of just releasing open weights, there's a lot more sort of thorough research done on those models and a lot more reproducible research that can be done on those models because we understand we can see everything about the model and we know we're working with a consistent model. Whereas a lot of the studies that are done on ChatGPT, for example, like we don't know if underneath, and this was a scandal that happened with ChatGPT where they're able to update the underlying model of the API at will. We don't understand if they're updating the versions of the model. They're not necessarily transparent or disclosing all the different changes to the underlying mechanisms of the API. And so if all we can interact with is this product, that does interfere with our ability to make like strong guarantees about what the model is doing and how it's working. And so I think we're in alignment in the sense of like, if we're going to go closed, we need full access, at least as regulators or auditors. Yeah.
We actually only have time for one more question, and so let me bring it back to the EU AI Act. This is a little bit asking each of you to look into a crystal ball and thinking about the context of the Brussels effect that was referenced on the panel. Do you foresee that the EU AI Act will have the Brussels effect and ripple out around the world, or do you envision that it won't have that effect? Gerard, I see you looking right at me.
There was another point I wanted to make and a pitch I want to make. So I'm going to answer this question and then just add on like things I came here to say and I haven't said yet, if I may, but it's going to just be half a minute. So I think on the Brussels effect, I mean, yeah, there's likely going to be a Brussels effect, not the kind of in a very broad spectrum, but I mean, there are certain elements in the AI Act, for example, around provenance and authentication and like call it watermarking, so that in the future you can distinguish, you can see something and you know this is manipulated and maybe you shouldn't trust it and this is authentic and therefore you can trust it. That's something that also, for example, in California, there are bills around that provenance and authentication, so imposing some obligations on the open AIs and the large language model providers to make sure that whenever some content is developed with the help of their large language model, it's recognizable as such. So I think that type of action you will see relatively quickly because, of course, it's very relevant, particularly in the context of the elections and kind of our democratic discourse. There might be other elements as well, and maybe more on a sectoral basis that in some sectors, kind of some countries will go first. I think there is also generally, I mean, and we see it now with DSA, and I mean, we are spending a lot of time discussing with third countries. I mean, I traveled to Australia and New Zealand to discuss the EU AI Act because there was genuine interest in understanding like what was behind, why did you take this definition, what about the risk assessment framework? I mean, how do you manage that? What about kind of some of these categories? So the discussions are going on. I think, and now I'm going to link it with the kind of the point I wanted to make, which is the enforcement capacity. I mean, there's one thing and that's easier in the EU than it is in the US and probably many other jurisdictions too, because we still haven't, we still haven't lost the art of compromise in the European Union, fortunately. So we have the EU AI Act. But what is very challenging now is making it work, because you need enforcement. No law is going to work just spontaneously without kind of oversight. And so that is, I mean, we're now, and this is the pitch I'm going to make today, there was a publication. I mean, we published a call for expressions of interest for jobs in Brussels because we're building the AI Safety Office, the AI Safety Institute in Europe, and there's very few people there now, but by the end of the year, there need to be at least 100 or maybe more. So we need to have very good kind of, participation. And if there's anybody here with a European passport and computer science degree and or AI knowledge, I mean, please apply, come and see us afterwards, because we want you. So please come to Brussels. But I think on the enforcement side, also the market surveillance authorities that are kind of, I mean, yes, there's a lot of sectoral regulators, but don't underestimate the kind of the learning curve that these regulators are on at the moment. It's all complicated. I mean, our regulators that do market surveillance, yes, they can look at a lawnmower and see whether the lawnmower is safe. If they go into a store, they can see whether the yogurt is beyond the expiry date. That's all kind of, they know how to do that. But to to look at the product that has AI in it, a medical device or what, that's more complicated. So I mean, and we are now building this up. One of the areas for absolutely for international cooperation is between the different AI institutes.
Gerard,
The
I'm going
UK
to
is
interrupt
building
you.
it up, and the US is building it up. So that's where a lot of work now needs to be done.
Okay. And
Last word.
putting together this panel, we knew that it was going to be provocative, and it did not disappoint. So I'm incredibly grateful for all of you in contributing. Yes, this is a very difficult challenge that we're all facing right now, and how to appropriately oversee this technology. Now we're going to be taking a quick break for about 15 minutes. So please return. As a reminder, the restrooms are there. I believe there is still coffee. And please come back at 45 minutes after the hour.